She said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. Elena Whitfield swept into the diner with her team still trailing the press conference's energy. She stopped when she noticed the man at the corner table, plain flannel, worn shoes, a paper receipt showing $12. "Some people," she said, "don't have the vision to invest in a decent lunch." Her assistant smiled on cue. The man folded the receipt slowly, slid it into his pocket, and looked up. He didn't speak. His eyes held something she couldn't name. 2 weeks later, his signature on a single document collapsed her $90 million merger. David Cole had been awake since 5:30. That was the rhythm of it: alarm, coffee, the quiet work of being both people at once. He moved through the kitchen without turning on the overhead light. Muscle memory guiding him to the cabinet for Ethan's cereal, to the drawer for the good spoons, to the spot on the counter where he left the lunch money the night before. Ethan came downstairs in his socks, hair still pressed flat on one side, dragging his backpack by a single strap. "You made eggs," the boy said. "I made eggs." Ethan sat and looked at the plate with the kind of seriousness a 9-year-old reserves for important assessments. "Mom used to put hot sauce on them." David set a glass of orange juice down in front of him. "I know. Do we have hot sauce?" "Back of the fridge." Ethan found it and came back satisfied. They ate without the television on. That was a rule David had kept without ever explaining it. Mornings were quiet. Mornings were theirs. Mornings didn't belong to anyone else. At 7:40 he walked Ethan to the corner where the bus stopped, watched until the yellow doors closed, then got into the Civic and headed downtown. The Richmond clerk's office and records division occupied the ground floor of a gray stone building on East Main Street that most people passed without noticing. David had worked there for 2 years, logging deeds, cross-referencing property transfers, maintaining the kind of precise institutional memory that the city depended on, and no one ever thought to thank. His supervisor, Pat, described him to new hires as the one who never makes a mistake and never talks about it, which David understood as the highest compliment Pat was capable of giving. He was good at the work because he was good at reading documents, at seeing the seam where something didn't quite fit. That morning, before he left for the bus stop, he'd read the Richmond Business Journal piece on the merger. Whitfield Financial Group, led by CEO Elena Whitfield, was pursuing an acquisition of Cornerstone Community Bank in a deal valued at $90 million. The article called it a landmark consolidation of Richmond's mid-tier financial sector. There was a photo of Elena at a podium, sharp-jawed and composed, holding a question from a reporter with the patience of someone who had learned patience through practice. David read it twice and set the paper down. He had heard the name Cornerstone before, from a different kind of document in a different kind of life, but he folded the paper, finished his coffee, and thought about it on the drive to work. By the time he reached East Main, he had almost set it aside. At noon, he walked 4 blocks to a diner he had been going to since his first week at the clerk's office. He ordered what he always ordered. He ate slowly and read the afternoon edition on his phone. He did not see her come in. He heard the door, heard the change in the room's atmosphere the way you hear weather shifting, and then he heard the voice carrying, practiced, aimed just a degree too wide to be accidental. He folded the receipt. He put it in his pocket. He looked up. She was already looking somewhere else. He didn't go straight home. He sat in the Civic in the parking structure for 11 minutes. Engine off, hands loose in his lap. Outside, Richmond moved at its usual afternoon pace delivery trucks, a group of interns in matching lanyards, pigeons working the edge of a food cart. Ordinary. All of it completely ordinary. Then he drove home, made dinner, helped Ethan with a worksheet on long division, and waited until the boy was asleep. The study was a small room off the hallway that had started as a reading room and gradually become something else. There were 2 shelves of law journals he kept for reasons he couldn't entirely justify, a desk with a locked bottom drawer, and a framed photograph of Sarah and her father on the day of his retirement. Robert Henley, 22 years in HR at Cornerstone Community Bank, standing in front of a cake he was too proud to look embarrassed about. David unlocked the drawer with a key he kept on his actual keychain, between the car key and the house key, where anything could hide in plain sight. The folder inside was not thick. It didn't need to be. It held a 10-page trust agreement, a letter on the letterhead of his former firm, and a handwritten note from Robert, dated 8 months before Robert died the same year Sarah did, the worst year of David's life, running parallel to itself. David spread the documents on the desk, The trust agreement named him as independent trustee of the Cornerstone Community Bank Employee Pension Trust. The appointment had come from Robert directly, formalized through the firm, and it carried with it a specific legal obligation. Under federal fiduciary law, any merger or acquisition affecting the pension fund required the written approval of the independent trustee before it could be finalized. Not a rubber stamp, not a formality. An actual determination made by a named individual who was personally liable if he approved something that harmed the beneficiaries. 312 current and former Cornerstone employees depended on that fund for retirement. David had known about the Whitfield merger for 11 days, since the initial public announcement. He had told himself he was monitoring it, that it might come to nothing, that he still had time. He pulled up the Richmond Business Journal piece on his laptop. Read it again, more carefully. Looked at the timeline. Looked at the proposed valuation. Somewhere in the back of his mind a calculation ran quietly, the way it always had, the old reflex, the one he thought he had put away for good. The woman who had smiled at his $12 lunch was the CEO driving the deal. She didn't know that the man she'd dismissed without a second thought was the one person in Richmond whose name needed to appear on the merger approval for it to be legally complete. He closed the laptop, turned off the desk lamp, sat for a long moment in the dark. Robert had said when David signed the agreement, "I'm not giving this to you because you're the smartest man I know, though you are. I'm giving it to you because you're the most honest one." David folded the documents back into the folder and locked the drawer. He wasn't going to do anything yet. He was going to watch. The woman who had laughed at his lunch did not know that his signature could end her career. She came in on a Thursday. David was at his station, working through a stack of deed transfers, when he heard her name at the front desk. He recognized the voice before he looked up. That same carrying quality, though lower now, less performative. Elena Whitfield, accompanied by a single legal aid, was requesting access to property records associated with 3 parcels of land in the Cornerstone transaction. It was a standard step in due diligence, the kind of thing that had to happen in person at the clerk's office when the originals weren't digitized. Routine, except that the section of the archive she needed fell under David's caseload. He let Pat handle the intake. He watched from the side of the room while Elena stood at the counter signing the access log, and he had time, 4 or 5 seconds, to decide how he wanted this to go. He walked over. "I can pull those," he told Pat, and Pat, grateful to return to the coffee that was going cold on her desk, stepped aside without comment. Elena looked up. Something moved across her face, a small calculation, rapid and visible to anyone paying attention. She recognized him. He could see the moment of recognition followed immediately by the decision about what to do with it. "The records you need are in Section 12, David said. "There are 3 boxes. Some of it's been partially digitized, but the originals will have the surveyor stamps you'll need for legal verification." "Thank you," Elena said. Her voice was even. He led her back through the narrow corridor between shelving units. She walked 2 paces behind him and said nothing until they reached the correct row. "I owe you an apology," she said. "What I said at the diner the other day, it was unprofessional." David set the first box on the reading table and considered his answer. "You'll need to check the parcel numbers against the original survey lines. The boundaries on the 1987 plat don't match the 2009 revision, and the discrepancy needs to be noted in your filing." Elena was quiet for a moment. "All right, there's a magnifier in the top drawer. Some of the stamps are faint." He left her with the boxes and went back to his desk. 20 minutes later, she was still there, working through the records with a focused efficiency that was different from her public manner, quieter, more particular. Her legal aid had stepped out to take a call. She was alone. David's phone buzzed, a text from a number he recognized, Richard Voss, appearing at the top of Elena's screen as she set it face up on the table, visible for one unguarded second before she turned it over. He hadn't meant to look. He noted it anyway. The message he caught in that second: "Tell her the timeline doesn't move. Close by Friday." Elena didn't tell David she was leaving. She set the copied documents in her case and walked out without looking at the desk where he sat. But at the door she paused, just briefly, and David could not have said why except that she did. The boardroom on the 14th floor of the Whitfield Financial Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows that framed a sweep of the James River on clear days. Today was not a clear day. Low cloud pressed flat against the glass, and the river was the color of old pewter. Richard Voss stood at the head of the table. He was 58, built like a man who had once been athletic, and now used that architecture mainly to take up space. He had been on the Whitfield board since Elena's father ran the company, and he operated with the particular authority of someone who had outlasted everyone who might remember his actual record. "Friday is not negotiable," he said. "The Cornerstone board is aligned. Their counsel is aligned. We have a signed term sheet. The only thing between us and closing is administrative processing." Elena kept her hands flat on the table. "The independent trustee review hasn't been completed. That's a formality. The trustee is some clerk in the county records office. He'll sign off. He's an independent fiduciary, Richard. Under federal law, that review. I know what the law says, Elena. I also know that nobody has ever seen a trustee of that type refuse a merger of this kind. It doesn't happen. He let that settle. The market window is real. If we push past the end of the quarter, Cornerstone's next earnings report hits and the valuation picture changes. We move now." Elena looked at the documents stacked in front of her. 43 pages of merger conditions, financial projections, liability assessments. She thought about the property records she had gone through that afternoon at the clerk's office. The careful notations in the margins of the archive boxes, neat, precise, made by someone who paid attention to the gap between what a document said and what was actually true. "We move when the review is complete," she said. Voss smiled the way he always smiled when he had decided to let something go temporarily. "Of course." 3 floors below the boardroom, in a shared workstation area adjacent to the compliance department, Denise Ruiz was finishing a spreadsheet reconciliation she had been assigned that morning. She was 34, had worked at Whitfield for 3 years, and was the kind of employee whose work was good enough that she was consistently assigned more of it without any corresponding change to her title or salary. She had been given a folder of Cornerstone financials to format for the due diligence package, routine. She was halfway through the 3rd tab when she noticed the formula in column N. The number it produced did not match the number in the printed summary on the desk beside her. She checked the formula twice. She checked the printed summary. She looked at the source data. The printed number was $22 million smaller than the figure the spreadsheet actually calculated. She closed the file, opened it again. The formula was still there. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she closed it again, picked up her bag, and left for the evening without saying anything to anyone. At home, 2 miles east, David Cole was at the kitchen table with the Cornerstone annual reports from Robert's files spread in front of him, comparing numbers to the public disclosures Whitfield had filed with the state. A yellow legal pad beside him was covered in neat handwritten figures. 3 line items didn't reconcile. The variance, across 3 years of reports, added up to roughly $22 million. He circled the figure, wrote nothing else next to it. He was going to need more than this before he acted. He was also beginning to understand that there wasn't much time left to find it. The diner was quieter on weeknights. Elena had been sitting in the parking lot for 6 minutes before she went in. She didn't examine the reason too closely. She told herself she was here because it was on the way home, and she'd had a bad afternoon, and she owed the man an actual apology, not the clipped half-sentence she'd offered him in the archive room. She also told herself those things in the order most likely to make her go inside. He was at a table near the window, not the same one as before, but the same general geography, the same quality of stillness. He was not alone. A boy sat across from him, maybe 9 years old, working through a bowl of something with the single-minded focus of a child who has been told to finish his dinner. Elena almost turned around. She didn't. David saw her when she was still near the door. He said something low to the boy, who looked up, looked at her, and went back to his bowl. "Sorry to intrude," she said, stopping at the edge of the table. "I just wanted to. I didn't finish what I was saying this afternoon." David looked at the empty seat across from him, then back at her. "Sit down if you want." She sat. "This is Ethan," David said. "Ethan, this is Miss Whitfield." Ethan looked up with the kind of frank, undefended appraisal that children deliver without knowing it. "Do you work with my dad?" "Not exactly," Elena said. "She came into the office today," David said. "She had some questions about property records." "That's boring," Ethan said without malice. "Yes," Elena said. "It mostly is. Something loosened, slightly, in her shoulders. She ordered coffee. David ordered a second cup. They talked about nothing important. First, the weather, the road work on Broad Street that had made the morning commute miserable for 2 weeks, whether the diner had always had that particular crack in the ceiling above the pie case, or if it was new. Ethan finished his bowl and started on a drawing in the small notebook he'd pulled from his backpack, apparently satisfied that the adult conversation had fallen below the threshold requiring his attention. "I'm told closings like the one I'm working on are straightforward," Elena said, at some point. "Not a question exactly." David looked at his coffee. "Most of them are, but not all." "Not all." She watched him for a moment. There was something in the way he answered the 2-beat pause before the words, the complete absence of performance that she hadn't expected. She had gotten used to people in her professional life saying everything at full volume. "Can I ask what you did before the clerk's office?" she said. David considered the question with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything. "Law," he said. "Private practice." "What kind?" "Compliance. Mostly corporate." Elena didn't say anything for a moment. She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn. "Why'd you leave?" He glanced toward Ethan, who was drawing what appeared to be a submarine, and back. "I needed to be somewhere that let me be home by 5. It was a complete answer, and also not one at all. Elena recognized the move. She had deployed it herself often enough. She didn't push. When they stood to leave, she stopped at the register on the way out. The server behind the counter took her card. David noticed from across the room but said nothing, just guided Ethan toward the door with a hand at the boy's shoulder. Outside, he paused on the sidewalk and looked back at her through the diner window with an expression she couldn't read, not surprised, not grateful, not particularly anything. Then he turned and walked to his car. Elena drove home and sat at her dining table with the merger documents open in front of her for a long time. There was a shape to what she was looking at that she had accepted because Voss had presented it, and because Voss had always been there, and because she had been 29 years old when her father died, and Richard Voss had been the one who told her she could run the company. She turned to the liability section and began reading it again from the beginning. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. It was addressed to Marcus Webb, not David Marcus, David's former colleague from his years at Callaway and Reed, the man who had turned a mid-level compliance practice into a regional reputation for untangling exactly the kind of corporate knots that firms created when they thought no one was watching. Marcus was now working as outside counsel for Cornerstone Community Bank, a small engagement he'd taken on 6 months ago because Cornerstone's general counsel was a friend, and the bank had seemed stable. Marcus called David that afternoon. "I need you to look at some documents for me," he said. "Not officially. Just look at them." "What kind of documents?" "The kind that might be nothing, or might be a significant problem. I can't tell from where I'm standing, and I don't have anyone else I trust to read them correctly." The file arrived digitally, routed through an encrypted transfer Marcus had used since their firm days. David opened it after Ethan was in bed. There were 41 pages. He read them in 90 minutes. 3 sets of internal emails. 1 spreadsheet embedded in a financial summary. 2 sets of meeting notes that did not appear in any official board record. The emails were between Richard Voss and a third party David didn't recognize. They spanned 8 months. Their subject was the Cornerstone acquisition, and their contents were specific. They discussed the deliberate suppression of a $22 million non-performing loan portfolio from the figures provided to Whitfield Financial's due diligence team. The purpose, as Voss stated it in one email with remarkable plainness, was to preserve favorable valuation optics through closing. Favorable for whom, the emails made clear, was the board and the third party. Not the pension beneficiaries. Not Cornerstone's employees. Not Elena. The spreadsheet matched the variance David had found in Robert's annual reports. The number was exact, $22 million. David sat with the file open on his screen for a long time. If the merger closed on the manipulated figures, the pension fund would inherit a balance sheet that was $22 million weaker than disclosed. Under the trust agreement he held, that was a direct fiduciary harm to 312 beneficiaries. Many of them were people Robert had known by name. People who had spent decades at Cornerstone assuming their retirement was safe. He thought about Elena at the diner, turning her coffee cup. He thought about the careful way she'd said not all when he'd given her the easy answer about closings. She hadn't known. He was almost certain she hadn't known. He also thought about what it would mean to act, what would come out, what would become public, who would understand and who wouldn't. He got up and went to the small shelf in the hallway where Sarah's photograph stood. She was laughing in it, caught mid-sentence at what David remembered was a very bad joke her father had told. Robert was in the background, already laughing harder than the joke deserved. He stood there for a while. Then he went back to the study, unlocked the bottom drawer, and took out the pen he used to sign legal documents. He had not used it in almost 2 years. He held it for a moment. Then he sat down at the desk and began to write. The press conference was scheduled for 10 o'clock. The Whitfield Financial boardroom had been rearranged for media access cameras in the back, logo backdrop, a table set for 4 in front of the windows. Richard Voss had arrived 40 minutes early, which was unusual. He stood near the coffee service and spoke with the 2 board members who had arrived at the same time, his voice carrying the low, contained energy of a man who had been waiting a long time for a particular morning. Elena arrived at 9:45 with the merger documents in a leather portfolio. She was dressed for the cameras and felt nothing about that. She had reviewed the liability section 3 more times in the past week, asked 2 questions that Voss had answered, and accepted the answers in the way that she recognized now, too late, as a habit she had built around him specifically. She sat down. The cameras adjusted. A publicist whispered something about framing. At 9:57, Voss's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and something changed in his expression, a quick contraction. Gone almost immediately, replaced by the usual composed width. He stepped to the side of the room. Elena watched him. 2 minutes later, a legal aide came to her shoulder and spoke quietly. There was an emergency filing. From the independent trustee of the Cornerstone Community Bank Employee Pension Trust, received by the State Fiduciary Oversight Office at 9:45 this morning. The aide placed a printed copy in front of her. The document was 6 pages. The signature at the bottom belonged to David A. Cole, independent trustee. The filing was a formal objection to the merger approval, citing material misrepresentation of pension-related liabilities in the disclosed financial statements, specific reference to a $22 million non-performing loan portfolio omitted from due diligence documentation, and a notice that under federal and state fiduciary law, the transaction could not be legally finalized without independent trustee concurrence, which was being withheld pending investigation. The room had not yet noticed. The cameras were still adjusting. Voss was still on the phone at the side of the room, his back to everyone now. Elena read the filing twice, then she looked at the signature. David A. Cole. She thought of the corner table, the folded receipt, the way he had met her eyes without any particular expression. She thought of him saying quietly in the archive, "The originals will have the surveyor stamps you'll need." She set the document flat on the table. "We're postponing," she said, loud enough for the room to hear. Voss came off the phone. Their eyes met across the room. Elena stood up. She came in at 8:40 in the morning, before most of the staff arrived. David was already at his desk, working through the morning's intake, when she appeared at the counter. She had not called ahead. She was not accompanied by a legal aide or a publicist or anyone at all. She wore the same expression she'd had at the counter on her first visit, only the composition beneath it was completely different now. "You could have told me," she said. "You had 3 opportunities." David set down what he was working on. "No," he said. "I didn't." She came around to where the half door in the counter opened to the records floor and stood in front of his desk. "Why not?" "Because you needed to make a decision about the merger based on what you actually knew. Not because a county archivist told you to look somewhere specific." Elena absorbed that. "You knew about the discrepancy. The $22 million, I suspected it. I didn't have documentation until 5 days ago." 5 days, she repeated. "Once I had it, I acted." She was quiet. The office was quiet around them, just the distant sound of the building's ventilation, and farther off, a delivery door opening and closing. "I said something terrible to you," she said, "in front of people, and you never used it. You could have gone to the press immediately. You could have made it personal." "It wasn't personal," David said. "It was humiliating." Yes. He didn't qualify it or soften it. It was. And then, I had a job to do. Elena looked at him for a long moment. She had conducted difficult conversations for 15 years with boards, with regulators, with journalists who wanted a version of events that made a better story than the truth. She was good at them. She knew how they worked. This one she couldn't locate herself inside. 312 people, she said. Their names are in the trust documents. Robert kept a list. Updated every year. Robert Henley. He was your father-in-law. He was. She looked down at her hands. I'm going to call an emergency board session this afternoon. The evidence you filed with the state office, I'll need you to present a summary for the board. I can prepare one. And Voss. I know. She moved toward the door, then stopped. She turned back. You said you needed me to do the right thing, she said. At the diner. You said that. I don't remember the exact words. You said you didn't need an apology. You needed me to do the right thing. He nodded slowly. Something like that. Okay, Elena said. Okay. She left without looking back. David watched the door close. He sat at his desk for a moment, with his hands still. Then he picked up the intake files and went back to work. Elena was 30 seconds into her opening remarks before Voss understood what was happening. She had called the board session for 4 o'clock. 11 members of the Whitfield Board of Directors sat around the long conference table, some of them visibly irritated at the short notice. Voss had arrived 5 minutes early, as he always did. He sat at his usual position, 3 seats to her right, with the stillness of a man who had decided to manage whatever was coming from a position of complete control. Elena placed 2 documents in the center of the table. I'm calling for an immediate review of the Cornerstone acquisition, she said, and I'm calling for an immediate suspension of Richard Voss pending investigation. The room split along 3 different reactions: surprise, confusion, and from 2 board members on the far left, a careful absence of any expression at all, which told Elena something she filed away. She presented for 40 minutes. The $22 million. The suppressed loan portfolio. The emails between Voss and the third party. The spreadsheet. The independent trustee filing. The formal statement from Denise Ruiz, written the previous evening after Elena had called her directly and spoken for 30 minutes, a conversation Elena had opened with, I know what you found, and I need you to tell me in your own words. Denise had said, I've had that spreadsheet open for 2 weeks. I didn't think anyone would believe me. Elena had said, I believe you. That conversation had changed the shape of the afternoon in ways Elena was still absorbing. Voss spoke once, 15 minutes into the presentation. He said, This is a mischaracterization of a complex financial. Elena looked at him. He stopped. She kept presenting. By 5:30, the board had voted 9-2, the same 2 who had shown no expression, abstaining rather than dissenting to suspend Voss pending investigation, freeze the merger, and refer the matter to the state financial regulator and the U.S. Department of Labor's Employee Benefits Security Administration. Voss walked out without speaking. One of his allies in the room followed 30 seconds later. Elena stood at the window for a moment after the room cleared, looking at the James River. The low cloud from earlier in the week had broken, and the water was picking up the last of the afternoon light. She issued a public statement at 6:45. It named the fraud, referenced the trustee filing, and credited the action of the independent trustee of the Cornerstone Community Bank Employee Pension Trust for preventing significant harm to beneficiaries. It included, as a final paragraph, a direct personal apology to David Cole for comments she had made publicly on the 1st of the month. The paragraph was 3 sentences. She had rewritten it 4 times until it said what it actually meant, and nothing else. That evening, Ethan asked his father at dinner if he'd seen the news. A little, David said. There's a CEO lady who said something bad about you, and then said sorry on TV. She did. Ethan thought about this. Was she actually sorry, or was she just saying it? David considered his son with the same attention he gave most things. I think, he said, she meant it. Ethan nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his dinner. The merger closed on the 14th of March, 61 days after the original press conference. The final terms were different in 12 material ways from the original filing. The non-performing loan portfolio was disclosed, assessed properly, and priced into the acquisition with a corresponding reduction in the purchase amount. The pension fund was ring-fenced from the consolidated balance sheet for a period of 5 years, subject to independent actuarial review. The new agreement required the signature of the independent trustee. David signed on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room on the second floor of Cornerstone's main branch on West Broad Street. The Cornerstone General Counsel shook his hand. Marcus Webb, who had flown in for the occasion, shook his hand. Two people from the State Oversight Office nodded from across the table. Elena was also there. She had sat to his left during the review of the final documents, and they had spoken only about the document's technical points, reference page numbers, the two clauses that still needed clarification. Professional, précise. When the signing was complete, she had said, "Thank you." He had said, "Robert would have wanted this done right." She had looked at him for a moment with something in her face that he recognized, the same quality he had seen briefly in the records room on her first visit, when she had paused at the door without knowing why. Neither of them said anything more. That was in March. By April, the diner had become a habit. It wasn't planned. She had business near East Main 3 or 4 times a week as the merger integration moved forward, and the diner was convenient, and Ethan had apparently decided that Elena's opinion of his drawings was worth seeking. He had shown her the submarine. He had shown her the subsequent aircraft carrier, and the inexplicable addition of a horse standing on the aircraft carrier's deck, which he called Perry and declined to explain further. Elena had looked at Perry for a long moment and said, "I think he adds something." Ethan had agreed. David watched this from across the table and said nothing. One afternoon in late April, they were finishing lunch when Ethan spotted a friend from school in the parking lot and asked, in the direct and unstoppable way of 9-year-olds, if he could go say hello. David said yes. The boy was out the door before the word had fully landed. The diner was quiet around them. The lunch rush had cleared. Someone at the counter was reading a newspaper. A song was playing low from somewhere in the kitchen. Elena pushed the last of her cup aside and looked out the window toward Ethan, who had found his friend and was now engaged in an elaborate description of something that required both hands. She picked up the breadbasket and offered it across the table. David reached for a piece at the same moment she did, and their hands met over the basket just briefly, just the side of his hand against her fingers, unhurried on both sides, and neither of them pulled away. Through the window, Ethan pointed at something across the street, entirely absorbed, entirely unaware. The song from the kitchen played on. Neither of them had been looking.